The evening air was cool and calm, with the soft hum of a few cars passing by and the distant chatter of people enjoying their evening. The streets were quiet, a typical small-town scene. As the sun began to set, the golden light spread across the town, painting everything in warm hues of orange and pink. The street lamps flickered on, casting soft glows over the sidewalks, which were mostly empty at this hour. The town had a certain peaceful charm to it, as though nothing could disturb the tranquility. Marcus Carter, a black soldier, walked down the middle of the street, his boots tapping against the pavement. He was dressed in full military uniform, dark green fatigues, a crisp white shirt beneath, and a polished black cap on his head. The uniform, though worn and practical, still held a certain pride. It wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of his dedication and service. His shoulders were squared, his posture straight, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their worth but wasn't seeking attention. His face was calm, a hint of exhaustion in his eyes from the long day, but there was a soft pride in the way he walked. As he moved down the street, a few people glanced his way, some nodding respectfully, others merely passing by, lost in their own world. He didn't expect recognition. He wasn't seeking it. His service had never been about the spotlight. For Marcus, it was about doing what was right, fighting for something greater than himself. He didn't need the world to know his name or acknowledge his uniform. His chest swelled with quiet pride, but his eyes stayed focused on the diner up ahead. It was just another evening, just another meal before heading home. The sun's fading light reflected off the diner's neon sign, flickering in the distance. The cafe corner was a small-town staple, nothing fancy, but a place where people came to unwind after a long day. Marcus had passed it countless times, but tonight it felt different. The faint hum of chatter and clinking silverware escaped through the windows, a reminder of the town's unassuming but warm heart. It was familiar and comforting, a small piece of normalcy after a long and exhausting shift in the military. As Marcus neared the diner, he caught sight of a few locals sitting on the sidewalk, some sipping coffee and chatting about their day. A couple of kids raced each other down the street, their laughter cutting through the stillness. In the distance, a few older men leaned against a fence, deep in conversation, the smell of tobacco in the air. The whole town seemed to be moving in slow motion, like a peaceful painting captured at the perfect moment. But something about tonight felt different, too. There was an undercurrent in the air, something barely noticeable, but undeniably there. It wasn't fear, but rather a quiet tension, like the calm before a storm. Marcus didn't notice it at first. He was too focused on the comforting sound of his boots hitting the pavement, the cool breeze brushing against his face. But as he neared the diner, he saw a pair of headlights flash behind him. The soft hum of a car engine slowly grew louder, and Marcus instinctively glanced over his shoulder. A police patrol car was approaching from behind, its lights flashing softly as it moved toward him. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just passing through. The officer could have been responding to a call or simply taking his routine route through town. But as the car slowed down, Marcus's instincts told him something was wrong. The vehicle didn't speed up and pass him. Instead, it came to a slow stop just a few feet behind him. The car's engine rumbled quietly as the officer sat in the driver's seat, his gaze fixed on Marcus. The officer didn't speak yet, but there was something about his presence that set off a faint warning in Marcus's mind. Marcus slowed his pace ever so slightly, keeping his eyes forward. He wasn't sure what to expect. After all, he was in uniform, and this was his hometown. He had no reason to believe this encounter would be anything more than a simple acknowledgement. He'd seen the local officers before, and they had always been friendly. But tonight, things didn't feel the same. The police patrol car sat idling on the side of the street, its engine humming quietly, barely cutting through the still evening air. Inside, the two officers, Officer Miller and Officer Daniels, leaned back in their seats, seemingly oblivious to the world around them. They were chatting casually, their voices low and easy, a sharp contrast to the quiet hum of the town. Officer Miller, a man in his mid-30s, with short-cropped hair and a stern expression, was in the driver's seat. He had a reputation for being somewhat of a hard-nosed officer, but today he seemed a bit more relaxed than usual. He cracked open a can of soda, taking a long sip as he looked out the window. Beside him, Officer Daniels, younger by a few years and with a boyish face, flipped through a notebook, jotting down notes for what looked like a personal project. They weren't in any rush. There was nothing on the radio about calls or incidents to respond to. The night was slow, and they were just waiting for something to happen. It wasn't uncommon in a town this small for the hours to pass with little excitement, and tonight seemed no different. The officers laughed about something trivial, their voices mingling with the soft sounds of the evening. The only other noise was the distant sound of a dog barking and the occasional car passing by. They seemed comfortable, at ease in their usual patrol routine, but as they sat there, unaware, their casual talk was about to be interrupted by something that would change the course of their evening. It wasn't until Marcus Carter, the black soldier, came into their line of sight that the mood in the patrol car began to shift. The officers noticed him almost immediately, his military uniform clearly visible as he walked with purpose down the street. Officer Miller was the first to spot him. He squinted for a moment, eyeing Marcus from the driver's side, his brow furrowed. It wasn't the uniform that caught his attention, but rather the man wearing it. There was something about Marcus, about his presence, that didn't sit well with Miller. Maybe it was because he had seen people like Marcus before, men in uniform, who, in his mind, didn't belong in places like this, walking as if they were entitled to respect. "Hey, you see that?" Officer Miller nudged Daniels with his elbow. "What's this guy doing here, huh?" Daniels, distracted at first, looked up and followed Miller's gaze. As he caught sight of Marcus, his expression immediately shifted to one of judgment. It wasn't just the uniform that seemed to bother him, but the fact that Marcus was black. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he clicked his tongue. Without thinking, he muttered, "He's probably just another guy pretending to be a soldier." Officer Miller let out a short laugh, the words more mocking than amused. "Yeah, look at that uniform. I've seen enough fake soldiers to know when something's off." Without saying another word, both officers exchanged a look. Miller started the engine, his foot easing onto the gas as they pulled forward, slowly creeping up behind Marcus. The two men could already feel their bias taking over their judgment. As the car rolled up beside Marcus, Officer Miller leaned out of the window, his voice a little louder than necessary. "Hey, what are you doing here, soldier?" The words were said with a tone that was far from friendly, sharp, almost accusatory. Marcus slowed his pace as he heard the voice behind him, but he didn't turn around immediately. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone questioned him. He wasn't surprised. He was used to people looking at him as if he didn't belong in the uniform, and he had learned to rise above it. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man with pride in his service. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting the gaze of the two officers. His eyes flickered briefly over the badge and the patrol car, his calm demeanor not betraying the warning signs his mind was starting to process. He took a deep breath before answering. "I'm just heading to the diner, officer," he said, his voice steady, respectful. He raised his right hand slightly to show the military ID tucked into his breast pocket. "I'm a soldier, just finished my duty for the day." But the officers weren't buying it. Officer Daniels scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward in his seat. "Is that really your uniform?" he said with a sneer, clearly doubting Marcus's story. He didn't care about the military ID. He didn't care that Marcus was a soldier. All he saw was a black man walking down a street, and that alone triggered his suspicion. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly, a small but sharp signal that he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. He had hoped for a smooth encounter, but it was clear now that the officers weren't going to make this easy. "That's right," Marcus replied, trying to remain calm, his voice steady. "I'm wearing the uniform I earned, officer." Miller wasn't done yet. "Yeah? You sure you're not just trying to look like a soldier? I've seen plenty of people try to play dress-up. I'll be honest, I don't believe you." The mockery was unmistakable, each word dripping with disdain. The two officers began to laugh under their breath, exchanging knowing glances as if they'd just found something amusing. "You're really going to accuse me of impersonating a soldier?" Marcus's voice was quieter now, but his jaw was clenched, a sign that his patience was beginning to wear thin. He had to hold himself together. He couldn't let them get the best of him, not in front of people who might already be watching. But the officers weren't listening. They were getting bolder, their doubts about Marcus's identity turning into something darker. "Yeah," Miller said, leaning closer, his eyes running over Marcus's uniform. "You look like you're just out here playing dress-up. Soldiers don't walk around in this part of town. What's your real story, huh?" The officers continued their taunts, pushing Marcus further into an uncomfortable corner. But Marcus didn't break. He stood his ground, his heart racing slightly, but his resolve firm. He knew that this wasn't just about the uniform anymore. This was about respect. His pride as a soldier wasn't something that could be taken from him. He wasn't going to let these officers mock him or degrade his service, but he also knew he had to stay calm and in control. He took a breath, reminding himself that he was a soldier, and soldiers didn't crumble under pressure. "I'm just going to the diner," Marcus repeated, trying to maintain his composure. But the cops weren't done with him yet. They had made up their minds he wasn't a soldier. He was just another person to belittle. And they were going to keep pushing until he gave them a reason to stop. As the seconds ticked by, the air around Marcus became heavier, more suffocating. The officers were no longer just questioning him. They were digging in, picking apart his identity with every word they spoke. It wasn't about whether or not he was a soldier anymore. This was something deeper, more personal. The officers had already decided who Marcus was in their minds, and their judgments had nothing to do with his uniform or service. They were based purely on the color of his skin. Officer Miller, who had been the more vocal of the two, now leaned out of the patrol car with a look of derision on his face. His voice was laced with condescension as he addressed Marcus again. "You know, people like you don't belong here, pretending to serve the country," he said, his words sharp and biting, as though Marcus's mere presence in the uniform was an affront to everything he believed in. Miller's words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the entire street went quiet. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let his anger show. He was used to this. He had encountered prejudice before, but it never made it easier to swallow. He had fought in foreign lands, risked his life for a country that often treated him as less than. And yet here he was, being treated as if he didn't deserve the very uniform he wore. Before Marcus could respond, Officer Daniels, who had been quieter up until this point, chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just a criminal in disguise, huh?" His words were not a question. They were an accusation, an assumption based entirely on nothing more than Marcus's race and the fact that he dared to wear a military uniform. "We've seen your kind before. You're all the same." The sting of Daniel's words was sharper than Marcus had expected. His instincts told him to snap back, to defend himself, but he knew that would only escalate the situation further. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even when everything seemed to be falling apart. He took a deep breath, trying to remain composed, but it was harder now. The tension was suffocating. "I'm not a criminal," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm a soldier, and I fought for this country. I'm not your enemy." The officers ignored his words as though they had already written their narrative, and Marcus was nothing more than a character in it, a black man who didn't belong, who wasn't fit to be in their presence. Officer Miller straightened in his seat, a smug look crossing his face. "Step back," he barked at Marcus, as though he were speaking to a child. The command was simple, but it was laced with authority, meant to remind Marcus of his place. Daniels, who had been watching the exchange with increasing satisfaction, gave a quick nod. Without waiting for a response, Miller opened his door and stepped out of the car, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a thud. "You've been acting suspicious, so we're going to check you out," he said, his tone bordering on cruel. "Stay still." Marcus felt the surge of frustration building inside him, but he didn't move. He had been through far worse situations in his life, and he wasn't about to let these officers provoke him into doing something that could make matters worse. Still, the tension in his body was palpable, his jaw tight and his fist clenched at his sides. As Miller and Daniels stepped closer, they began to frisk Marcus, their hands rough as they checked his pockets, patting him down in an invasive and degrading manner. Marcus stood still, his face betraying nothing. But inside, a storm of emotions was raging. He had done everything right. He had shown them his military ID, given them respect, and yet here they were, treating him like a criminal. He wasn't their enemy. He was an American soldier, and yet they were treating him as though his life didn't matter. His heart began to race, but he stayed calm. He had no choice. "Are you satisfied now, officers?" Marcus's voice was low but thick with the weight of his frustration. "I've fought for this country. I've sacrificed for it. And I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to get to the diner." Miller smirked, ignoring Marcus's words. "Sure you are, soldier," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You're just a good guy, right? A real hero." Daniels, who had been silent during the frisking, now spoke up. "Yeah, you're the kind of hero who shouldn't be here. We know the type. You don't belong here." Marcus's chest tightened. He wanted to scream at them, to make them see how wrong they were, but he knew that would make things worse. So he stood there, silently enduring the ridicule, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. He felt humiliated, his dignity slipping away with every mocking word they spoke. As the officers finished their intrusive search, they stepped back, exchanging a look between themselves that Marcus couldn't quite place. Miller's next words came without warning, cold and final. "You're coming with us." He nodded at Daniels, who immediately reached for his handcuffs. The two officers moved toward Marcus, grabbing his arms with force as though he were some kind of criminal they had to subdue. "Wait," Marcus said, trying to stay calm despite the rising tide of frustration. "You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers didn't care. They continued to handle him roughly, ignoring his protests. As they slapped the cold metal cuffs around his wrists, the small crowd that had gathered nearby began to murmur in confusion and disbelief. Some people looked on in silence, unsure of what was happening, while others began to whisper among themselves, a mixture of curiosity and concern flashing across their faces. A few people stepped closer, perhaps to intervene, but when they saw the officers' stern expressions and the handcuffs, they quickly backed off, afraid of getting involved. Marcus couldn't help but feel the sting of public humiliation. Here he was, a decorated soldier, treated like a common criminal on the streets of his own town. And the people around him, his neighbors, watched as if this was normal. It was as if no one cared to stand up for him, even though they could clearly see what was happening. Through all of it, Marcus remained as composed as he could. His breath was shallow, his heart racing, but his face betrayed no emotion. He wouldn't let them break him. He had to keep his head, had to maintain control. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his integrity as a man and a soldier. "Let go of me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers weren't listening. They weren't interested in his innocence. They had already made their decision. They had decided that Marcus wasn't who he said he was, that he wasn't a soldier, that he was just another black man they could belittle and control. The situation had reached its boiling point. The crowd had grown larger, and the murmurs of confusion and disbelief were turning into hushed whispers. Marcus stood there, his wrists still bound by cold handcuffs, his composure barely holding on as the officers loomed over him. Officer Miller was mocking him, Daniels was sneering, and Marcus could feel the weight of their insults sinking in. It felt like there was no escape, no justice coming his way. But just as the tension in the air became unbearable, something unexpected happened. A black SUV appeared out of nowhere, its sleek frame cutting through the silence of the street. The vehicle's engine rumbled as it came to a stop, the tires screeching slightly on the pavement. The crowd, who had been watching the scene unfold, went quiet as the car's door opened. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't the usual town vehicle. No, this was different. The crowd felt the shift immediately. There was something about the way the car had arrived, authoritative, powerful. It was clear that whoever stepped out of that vehicle would be someone of great importance. The door of the black SUV swung open, and a tall figure stepped out. His presence was commanding, and the crowd instinctively parted to make way for him. The man was dressed in full military uniform, the fabric crisp and spotless. His attire gleamed with the insignia of a high-ranking officer. But it wasn't just his uniform that demanded respect. It was the way he carried himself. His stride was steady, his posture upright, and the confidence with which he walked was enough to make anyone take notice. It was General James Anderson, a man whose reputation preceded him, a man whose rank and authority were unmatched. He wasn't just anyone. He was a symbol of strength, discipline, and leadership. He had earned the respect of every soldier under his command, and now, as he stood in front of the crowd, his very presence radiated power. As he approached the scene, the air seemed to shift. The tension that had been building up, the hostility, the racial profiling, everything that had made Marcus's heart pound and his anger boil seemed to dissipate in an instant. People in the crowd watched with awe as the general walked toward the scene, his gaze fixed on the officers who were still standing next to Marcus, handcuffing him like a criminal. The crowd stood in stunned silence, some of them unsure of what to make of the situation. There were people who recognized the general immediately, their eyes widening with disbelief. Others were just trying to understand why a man of such importance had shown up at a routine police stop. But one thing was clear. The arrival of General James Anderson had changed everything. The officers, once so confident and cruel in their treatment of Marcus, now seemed small in comparison. Their posture shifted. The cocky, arrogant demeanor they had carried with them a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a mix of uncertainty and wariness. Officer Miller's hand, which had been resting on his belt, froze mid-motion as he turned to face the general. His lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time since the encounter began, he was speechless. Officer Daniels, standing next to him, looked equally stunned. He exchanged a quick glance with Miller, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Neither officer had anticipated someone of General Anderson's rank showing up. The general's presence was not only an unexpected surprise, it was a threat to their authority. The cops had just humiliated a soldier in uniform, one who had served his country, and now here was a high-ranking military officer, someone who could easily have them reassigned or worse. Marcus, despite the handcuffs, could feel the power shift in the air. The cops, who had been aggressive and domineering moments ago, now appeared unsure of their next move. It was as if they suddenly realized they were no longer in control of the situation. General Anderson's eyes moved from the cops to Marcus, and then back again to the officers, his gaze unwavering. His expression was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his demeanor. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to take control. He addressed the officers directly, his voice steady and clear. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but with an underlying sharpness that made it clear he wasn't seeking an answer he wouldn't like. The question seemed to hang in the air for a moment, but neither officer responded immediately. Instead, they just stared at him, processing the situation. Miller finally cleared his throat, his bravado slipping. Sir, this man, he was—" "I know who he is," General Anderson interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the officers. He then turned his gaze back to Marcus, his eyes softening for the first time since his arrival. "Soldier, are you all right?" Marcus, still stunned by the sudden appearance of his superior, nodded slowly. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, still holding on to the composure he had maintained through the entire encounter. "Yes, sir, I'm fine. Just a little out of place." The general's expression softened further. He didn't need to hear the whole story. The look in Marcus's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Miller and Daniels stood there, rooted to the spot, their hands awkwardly hanging by their sides as they processed what was happening. They had clearly underestimated Marcus, and now they were face to face with a man who had far more power than they did, someone who could easily make their lives miserable with a single phone call. "Do you have a problem with the way this man is being treated?" General Anderson asked, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. Miller opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. Daniels remained silent, his eyes darting nervously from the general to Marcus and back again. The general's presence was overwhelming, and they both knew that any attempt to argue their case would be futile. It was in this moment that the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in for both Marcus and the cops. Marcus, though still handcuffed, stood a little straighter now, his heart beating a little easier. The officers who had once towered over him with authority now seemed like mere shadows, their power eroded by the appearance of General James Anderson. The tension was still thick in the air, but now it was different. The officers had no choice but to stand down. They couldn't continue treating Marcus like a criminal, not in front of someone with so much authority. They couldn't continue their racial profiling, not when the general was watching. The air felt electric, charged with tension, as General James Anderson stood in front of the two officers. His commanding presence made the officers freeze, their once confident postures crumbling as they realized who they were dealing with. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. The crowd was silent, the hum of the evening still hanging in the air, but now every person there could feel the power shift. The cops, who had been so comfortable in their behavior just moments ago, now stood before a man who could bring their world crashing down in an instant. The moment General Anderson spoke, the entire situation changed. His deep voice cut through the silence with a tone of authority that left no room for argument. "You couldn't recognize a soldier in front of you?" he asked, his words sharp and clear, echoing in the stillness of the street. The officers, stunned and now painfully aware of their blunder, stumbled over their words. "Sir, we didn't mean—" Officer Miller began, but his voice trailed off as the reality of their actions set in. There was no defense. There was no justification. General Anderson turned to Marcus, his gaze softening as he addressed him with respect. "Soldier," he said, his voice now calm but firm, "are you all right?" Marcus, still in handcuffs, but now feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt before, nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied, the tightness in his chest slowly releasing. The crowd, who had been watching in disbelief, now watched with a mix of emotions, fear, relief, and awe. They had seen the cops torment Marcus, and now they were seeing a shift in power, one that was both gratifying and unsettling. The officers, who had once commanded the scene, now seemed almost small. As the general addressed the cops, the tension that had once hung heavy in the air began to dissipate. It wasn't just the cops who were being called to account. It was a moment for everyone who had witnessed the injustice to understand that there were people who would stand up and demand respect for the ones who deserved it. General Anderson turned back to face Officer Miller and Officer Daniels, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "You," he said, pointing at Miller, "you had the audacity to question this man's service, his honor, and his dedication to this country. A man who has fought, who has sacrificed, and you treat him like a criminal? You should be ashamed of yourselves." The words stung, and the crowd could feel the heat in the general's words. Officer Miller tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "Sir, we didn't know. We just—" "Don't you dare," the general cut him off. "You're supposed to know better. You're supposed to serve and protect, not judge based on your ignorance and hate. This man wears that uniform with pride. He's earned that uniform." "And yet you had the nerve to question it?" The general's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the fury in his tone. The crowd could feel the shift, and their eyes were wide, watching the officer's every move. This was more than just a reprimand. It was a public exposure of their racism, their failure to do their jobs properly, and now their public humiliation. Officer Daniels, who had been silently watching, now found his voice, though it was weak. "We're sorry, sir. We didn't mean it to go this far. We were just—" "Enough," General Anderson interrupted, cutting him off before he could finish. "You don't get to apologize now. The damage is done, and no apology will fix what you've done here." Both officers stood there, their heads hung low, their once proud uniforms now feeling like shackles rather than symbols of authority. They had crossed a line, and they knew it. The general stood tall in front of them, his eyes piercing through the officers as he spoke. "You will be facing consequences for this. I will make sure of it. Disrespecting a soldier, let alone one who has served this country with dignity, is not something that will be tolerated. You will learn that actions have consequences." The officers, defeated and humiliated, didn't speak. They just stood there, unable to refute the general's words. General Anderson's gaze turned back to Marcus, his tone now softened with understanding. "Soldier, I'm sorry you had to experience this. You deserve better than this treatment. Your service is what matters, not the ignorant actions of a few." Marcus, though still shaken by the whole ordeal, felt a sense of pride well up inside him. For the first time since the encounter had begun, he felt validated, not just by the general's words, but by the fact that someone had finally seen the injustice for what it was, and was willing to take action. The handcuffs that had bound him felt like they no longer had power over him. The two cops stood there, realizing that the very people they had been mocking and belittling had the power to bring their actions to light. They had underestimated Marcus, and they had definitely underestimated the general. The crowd watched in silence as the general made one final remark. "You two better hope your superiors don't hear about this. I'll be making sure your actions are reported." With that, General Anderson turned to Marcus, nodding his head as a sign of respect. "Get him out of those handcuffs," he ordered one of the officers nearby, who quickly complied. "Soldier, you are free to go, and thank you for your service." As the cuffs were removed from Marcus's wrists, he felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, the tension that had gripped the scene now easing as the officers walked away, their heads hung low. General Anderson stayed a moment longer, ensuring the cops understood the seriousness of their actions. Then, with one last commanding look, he turned to leave. 6. Resolution, ending with power and respect, 1,000 words. The apology. The two officers, now standing in front of General Anderson and Marcus, shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a clear sense of guilt. Officer Miller, his face red with embarrassment, was the first to speak. We're sorry, sir," he stammered. "We didn't mean for things to go this far. We were just doing our job." General Anderson's sharp gaze made it clear that the apology wasn't enough. Your job is to serve and protect," he replied coldly. "But your actions tonight were far from that. You've disrespected a soldier, a man who has fought for this country, and you think a simple apology will fix that?" Officer Daniels mumbled something about how they didn't realize who Marcus was, but his words held no weight. They could see now that they had made a serious mistake, one that would be hard to undo. Despite their words, the apology felt hollow, forced, and meaningless. The damage had been done, and no apology could erase the humiliation they had caused Marcus or the disrespect they had shown him. Marcus stood tall, his posture reflecting the pride that had always been a part of him, even in the face of adversity. He wasn't angry anymore. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was a fire behind it that no one could ignore. "I didn't fight for this country to be treated like this," he said, his words echoing in the stillness. "But I'll keep fighting for change. That's what soldiers do. We fight for what's right, even when it's hard." There was a quiet strength in his voice, a determination that shone through even in the face of injustice. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. His service, his dignity, and his belief in change spoke louder than any words ever could. General Anderson, who had been watching the scene unfold, finally offered Marcus a nod of approval. In a gesture that carried both respect and recognition, he saluted Marcus. Marcus returned the salute, their bond as soldiers undeniable, a moment of mutual respect that transcended the earlier tension. The general's salute wasn't just for Marcus's service. It was for his strength, his resilience, and the dignity he had maintained in the face of unwarranted disrespect. The silence of the crowd, which had been tense and uncertain throughout the ordeal, was broken by the sound of clapping. It started quietly at first, but soon more people joined in. Some were nodding their heads in approval, some had tears in their eyes, and some just stood there, quietly taking in the significance of what had just happened. The applause wasn't just for Marcus or the general. It was for the justice that had been served. It was for the acknowledgement that no matter who you are, what color your skin is, or what uniform you wear, you deserve respect. As the clapping died down, Marcus and General Anderson walked away together. Their backs were to the crowd, but the weight of their steps spoke volumes. Marcus, once the target of disrespect, now walked with the head held high, his dignity restored, and his resolve stronger than ever. The general walked beside him, not just as a superior, but as a man who understood the value of respect, equality, and honor. They didn't need to say anything more. Their silent departure spoke louder than any words ever could. The camera lingered on their backs, showing the two men walking away from the scene. The message was clear. Respect, equality, and justice should be the foundation of our society. Racism has no place here.